long history of Black men being overdiagnosed with conditions like schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder, these really severe kind of conditions. And I think that's largely because the diagnostic system that we have doesn't actually offer adequate access for Black people.
Hi there. Welcome to Students of Mind, the mental health podcast made by curious minds for curious minds. On this podcast, we, the hosts, are just like you, eager to learn more about the mind. Here we learn with you and provide you with clear, concise information backed up by real experts about all things mental health. My name is Jade.
And my name is Aminah, Jade's mom.
In today's episode, we sit down with Jor-El Caraballo and talk about the mental health experience of Black men and what it's like to be a Black man in the field of psychology. Today's guest is Jor-El Caraballo. Jor-El is a licensed mental health counselor with a focus on issues of race and gender identity, trauma and healing, discrimination and bias, sexuality, gender roles, and spirituality. Jor-El is the co-founder of Viva Wellness, a holistic-based mental health and wellness practice where he and his co-founder provide individual and couples therapy, coaching, and workshops. Jor-El is also co-host of the Viva Wellness podcast, and his work has been included in Teen Vogue, Essence, and Healthline. Welcome, Jor-El, and thank you for taking the time to be here.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm. So before we get into the questions, I know I said a little about you, but can you talk a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. And thank you for that great introduction. It's always interesting for me to hear sort of some of the things I've done read back to me because I'm like, oh, I guess I did do that. Yeah, that was good. That was good. But I'm obviously very proud of the work that I do. Most of the time, I am spending time with clients in session, providing individual therapy. That's really my bread and butter. I live in New York City, and I'm originally from North Carolina. I moved to New York City for graduate school about 10 years ago, and actually a little longer, and have been here ever since. And I really like mental health and therapy and psychology because it was really one way where I got to understand people more for myself. And therapy is the direct application of that knowledge. And so to me, it's just so important to be able to support people and offer skills and strategies and a non-judgmental space to help people learn about themselves and sort of come to their own understanding and practice new things. And so that's what I really love about psychology and mental health. And Viva Wellness was founded a couple of years ago with a longtime friend who was a business partner. We actually attended graduate school together, so that's where we met. And it's a really good match between, the task that we divide up as a business. We support each other very well, complement each other. And so we're really excited to be able to offer, all those services. And also online, we offer in our resources page, we have things for people who don't attend therapy with us that might help them on their journey, worksheets, recordings, handouts, relationship surveys you can do with your partner. So we try and reach as many people as we can with all the work that we do.
Yes, I actually directed someone to your resources page the other day because
cool.
I found that there are a lot of helpful tools on there. So I thought I would share that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I really wanted to have you on today because I'm doing this portion of the podcast where I talk about different aspects of mental health in the Black community. And I did an episode on Black women and our mental health, and I really think it's necessary and essential to do one for Black men. So I guess my first question is, what is the state of the mental health of Black men today? Like, what are the things we know about Black men's experiences with their mental health?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think 2020 is obviously an interesting year. And I think everyone is a bit more on edge and anxious and depressed or whatever that is for them than, maybe this time last year, generally speaking. And I think for Black men in particular, and I also speak from a place of personal experience as a Black man myself, um, I think it's been a really challenging time because none of the issues except for COVID are new. But when we talk about these racial justice issues, they've really sort of hit this more mainstream kind of coverage and conversation. And I think um, we're seeing a lot more content about racial injustices, police brutality, violence against Black bodies, particularly Black men. And so I think that for myself and also for a lot of clients that I've talked to, there's this ongoing sort of burden of being really conscious of that, being really conscious of how you walk in the world and how people are perceiving you. And I think that contributes to a lot of increased anxiety, fear, vigilance that comes with that and wanting to protect ourselves. And so I think that a lot of people are really struggling to figure out how do you be your best self at this point, knowing that there's so many things going on and we're having all these conversations much more often.
Mm-hmm. So that's like a picture of what things look like right now. How has Black men's mental health changed throughout the years, or has the way their mental health is approached and talked about, has that really changed at all much? Like what has that looked like throughout the years?
Yeah, I mean, as a therapist, I'm very encouraged that I see so many more Black men talking about mental health online. It's really been remarkable. And I think, I think it was maybe 2016, Kid Cudi had talked about his mental health issues. And it was the first time where we really saw a Black man who didn't have to share. It wasn't about an arrest or anything else that was going on. He was just talking about his experience with depression. And I found that so striking because it was like this one voice in a sea of like a lot of white people talking about their experiences with mental health. And so I think since then there's been an increase in Black men talking about mental health online, and I think that's in large part due to the encouragement of Black women who have been talking about these issues for longer and inspiring Black men to talk about their mental health. And I think that's also contributed to many more Black men seeing therapy as a viable space, a more viable space, for them than maybe in years past. And so I think there's a lot more interest or even just curiosity about therapy and mental health for Black men. And I think that's really good that we're now at a place where we can have more of those conversations like the one we're having today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I even in my short 20 years, I've seen a change. I think I talked about this in another episode, how I was on Instagram and saw a post where a Black priest was talking about his experiences with his anxiety, and I just thought that was
awesome,
amazing because not only was he Black, he was a man and a priest.
Mm-hmm.
So that was just like really important to me that it was put out for people to see.
Absolutely.
And so my last question kind of regarding this is in terms of like prevalence, are there any mental illnesses that are like statistically more prevalent in Black men than other groups?
That's an interesting question because I think what that brings to is like a really complicated discussion about diagnosis and mental health. Uh, and I'm not a statistician or researcher, but there's been a long history of Black men being overdiagnosed with conditions like schizophrenia, and antisocial personality disorder. Um, these really severe kind of conditions. And I think that's largely because the diagnostic system that we have and this healthcare system that we have doesn't actually offer adequate access for Black people. And so one thing that happens is that once these symptoms are first sought out or first experienced, people aren't getting the help that they need. So when they do get help, it's actually more severe. And so one of the stats we do see is that Black people, um, have, when they do seek out help, have more severe health outcomes. And that's a large part of that. And so that's a conversation about, were people getting diagnosed correctly? Like, do they have access to the right, providers who could see them accurately? And I think the one thing about schizophrenia in particular is that, one of the hallmarks of that condition is paranoia, right? And so when you think about living as a Black man in the United States, there's a lot of fear and quote unquote paranoia, but it's only paranoia if it's not grounded in reality. And so if you have a very visible record of why this fear and paranoia exist, then that would actually make you ineligible for schizophrenia. But if you are a provider who doesn't understand the impact of racism, if you don't understand the mental health implications of that, you might see someone in the hospital who is saying, like, I don't know what you're going to do to me. I don't trust you, as being paranoid and diagnose them with schizophrenia, whereas that's a well-founded belief system based on the history of medicine and healthcare. So it's just really interesting to think about how flawed this system is and how that we don't have really accurate data on Black mental health for that reason.
Wow, that's critical. So could you just explain really briefly what schizophrenia is and the other diagnoses that Black men tend to be misdiagnosed with? I think a lot of us are just so uneducated that we have these uninformed visions of what these mental illnesses really mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's generally a problem, right? Is that sometimes it's hard for us as providers to translate information to like a person who's not in the field,
Right.
Who doesn't have that background. But, schizophrenia in particular is a condition that's marked by, paranoia is a really prevalent symptom in most people. So that is kind of described as this irrational fear and of being persecuted or sought out or to be harmed. And that can often lead to hallucinations, some of which can be visual. So someone seeing things that a healthier person would not see. So, I've literally had a client once who was in an episode and perceived that there was a person sitting in a chair and that chair was empty, right? So it can be that extreme. It could also be much more like benign. And so another example is you can also have auditory hallucinations. So people hearing things that aren't actually there. And there was one client, a colleague of mine had, who used to have auditory hallucinations of like sort of like creatures like squirrels and birds and things like that were not in this person's area, right? But that's what he heard. And so that was a feature of his diagnosis. And sometimes people can even have tactile hallucinations. So they feel things on their skin, or they think they're touching something that actually isn't there. Right. And so I think those are like the biggest, the biggest sort of symptoms there. And obviously the risk there without treatment is that if you perceive certain things are there, you can act in accordance with what you believe is there, right? Or you could miss these really important cues that actually exist in the real world because you're preoccupied by a hallucination. So you might think there's someone you might think that there's someone following you, right? Or chasing you down the street, and you run across the street without looking and then end up getting hit by a car. And I think that's the most important thing to understand, is that people with mental health issues are far more likely to be the victims of crime and injury than the perpetrators. And I think that's really interesting when you think about that as it relates to Black men, because I think so often we're viewed as violent, aggressive, angry, big, brutish people. And I think that's part of the reason why conditions like antisocial personality disorder, like Black men, are probably really overrepresented, because that condition is basically marked by this sort of the character traits of believing that you don't have to follow the rules, that you don't need to be held liable for your actions. And so that you might take advantage of people, you might act in violent or aggressive ways. And what's really interesting about that is that a lot of Black men in prison may be diagnosed with this because they're breaking the law, right? So on paper, it's like, oh, you're breaking the rules. You think you're above the rules. But then you have to consider, well, what law was it, right? If this person was involved in a nonviolent crime, does that really make sense for that to be their diagnosis? If, for instance, like marijuana possession, right? Then you're like, oh, this person doesn't follow the rules, they're a criminal. But actually, are they a criminal, or are they just a person who happened to get caught, where there are 10 other people who just didn't get caught repeatedly? And then people suffer trauma when they're in prison, and they're in these systems that aren't really built for actual rehabilitation. So it can make things worse. Yeah.
I'm just thinking about right now of the show Empire. If you've ever watched it, but one of the main characters, a Black man, suffered from, I believe they titled it bipolar.
I think so, yeah.
But the way he presented to me and my minimal knowledge about bipolar, he wasn't really bipolar. He may have had some other mental health issues. And I think a lot of times as Black people, anyone that acts outside of any normal box, we call it bipolar. So can you talk a little bit about what bipolar actually means?
Yeah. And it's interesting because bipolar disorder, there are two types, first of all. And it can look very different depending on the person, right? Even with the same sub-diagnosis, for instance. So bipolar 1 is, and I should say, I used to watch Empire a long time ago.
Okay.
Like the first 2 seasons, and then I kind of fell off. And so I remember the characters, I think, was starting to have those, they're starting to show that. So I don't know what it's been like. So I can't really speak to that. But, bipolar 1 is represented by this sort of cycling between what we call mania and depression. So it used to be called manic depression. And so what that means is like people, obviously, I think most people more understand the concept of depression, right? Low mood, low energy, low motivation. Sometimes it comes with sadness, sometimes increased irritability, those sort of like markers. But for mania, that's, marked by this sort of compulsion to act in really risky ways. And so you're kind of like, it's kind of like for the best analogy I can describe it as is if someone is high, like on a drug, and it was like the best drug of their life. That's what it feels like to be manic. So you might do things that you wouldn't normally do because you feel really good. You will take risks that you wouldn't normally take because there's a part of you that feels euphoric. And so sometimes that manifests in like spending a ton of money that you shouldn't be spending. It might look in engaging in a lot of risky sex and not really thinking about consequences or implications. Driving excessively fast and taking other unnecessary risks, like those things like that. And so the bipolar 1 is characterized by that cycling. And so sometimes people cycle through that within like a couple of weeks of each other. They'll be like a week in a manic phase. And so they'll be a little bit more up and doing all these things and very busy and not sleeping for days on end. And then the depression will hit, and then they'll be in a depression for a period of time and really just be a shut-in, essentially. And actually, with both bipolar 1 and bipolar 2, substance abuse is really common concurrently. because that's a way that people manage the mood cycling often, right? And so that's, people can get in a lot of trouble because if you're manic, you're like, it's like you feel really good, but you also know that something's like off. And so you're like, okay, I need to come down. So someone might take something that brings them down, but then feel too depressed and then want to take something to pick themselves back up. And you get in a really dangerous cycle of like, is it the mental health? Is it the substance that you're taking that's putting you all over the place? So it can be really, really dangerous. And bipolar 2 is basically kind of like that, is characterized by more intense depression. And very what we call like hypomanic, which is kind of like a low mania. So you may not see someone who is, spending all their money or taking these incredible risks, but you might see someone who's like a lot more active than they usually are. They're like, they've done all the errands, and like within like 3 days, they're done all the errands. They made all these appointments. They like took care of so many things, but then that depression hits and it just really takes them out of the game. So they can't go to the appointments they made. They can't follow up on the things that they set up for themselves. And yeah, so sometimes people, and I think this might be the case with, is the character Dre on Empire? I can't remember. But sometimes people can also have psychotic features, which means like a disconnection with reality. So even someone with bipolar disorder could have sort of symptoms that might be similar to schizophrenia, because they might be thinking, oh, this is like, this person's out to get me. I need to protect myself. So I'm going to buy all these things to protect myself. Right. Or other ways that might manifest. So this is why it's so important, I think, for everyday people to not really get caught up in, oh, this is what bipolar is, or this is what depression is, because diagnosis is not a perfect science and it looks different on everyone. So you might think like, oh, this person is bipolar because they said they were bipolar or they read an article or whatever. But if you were to actually see a doctor or a licensed therapist, they say, actually, I think what you're dealing with is this, and this is how we treat that better.
I'm really glad that we took this little detour to talk about this, because I think if Black people are hearing what these diagnoses actually entail, and then they see that their behaviors aren't aligned with that, they can advocate for themselves when they do go to the doctor and they're misdiagnosed. So I think that little section that we had could be super helpful and maybe life-saving for someone to hear.
That's a great point.
Yeah, I think making sure that we're empowering people by educating them is really important. So I'm already super excited about this conversation.
Good.
You touched on how Black men and Black males are generally looked at as violent in this country. So can you talk about how historically Black men have had to navigate and express themselves in public or at home with this image of being violent? We see it in the media all the time. And I'm just curious about how that, one, impacts the mental health, but also does it impact a Black man actually seeking out therapy?
Absolutely. One of the books that was really transformative for me was a book by Bell Hooks called We Real Cool. Which talks about Black masculinity. And I thought it articulated so well the challenges of being a Black man. And so along with that being that perception of being strong, potentially violent or scary, there's also for Black men this stereotype of having to be cool right? You just like, oh yeah, like you can walk down the street and know people, they respect you and have this kind of air about you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what that does is, Black men are humans just like anyone else and have the range of emotions and feelings that anyone else experiences. But when you are caught up in this system, like culturally, that says you are only allowed to be this, then sometimes it can put you in this box of having to perform that exclusively, right, to the exclusion of the other things. And that can bring a lot of internal conflict. And so, one of the things I've seen in clients is, with Black male clients in particular, is coming to therapy and literally not having the language to describe their emotions.
Right.
But because no one ever taught them, because they didn't need to know, because they are strong and cool, right? It's everything's cool, everything's fine. And I think the one emotion that's often just afforded to Black men has been anger, at least publicly, right? And so that sort of reinforces that stereotype, because then you have people saying like, you have Black men saying the only emotion I can reasonably share without it being a threat to my masculinity or my race is to be angry. And so then you have them only expressing that one emotion, which reinforces that stereotype that that's all Black men are.
Right.
Meanwhile, this person internally is saying like, oh no, but I'm actually grieving. I just lost my mother. I just lost my good friend. And I'm sad, but I don't even have language to ask for support because I don't know how I differentiate sad from angry.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the mental health impact, is then when you don't even know what you're really feeling and what your body is telling you, how are you supposed to talk about it? How are you supposed to know where to go? And sometimes what happens is, the emotional lives of Black men is also weaponized against them, right? You have someone reaching out, even within their family, to say like, if you start crying, right? If a Black man starts crying, then a family member might say like, what are you crying for? Like, you just buck up, it's going to be fine.
Yeah.
You got to do what you got to do, right? And so then you never have space to be a mess. You never have space to explore what is sadness, what is irritation, what is actually joy, right? And be able to sit in that and experience with the fullness of what that is. And so it can really create problems in identifying what can help you, because you don't have the language and you don't have the support. You're just going it on your own a lot.
So how would this look for a younger Black male? So these things, do you think that they're learned just right from the beginning for young Black males? What do you think?
Yeah, I do think so. I will also say I think that we're in a time now that Black people are thinking about mental health and emotions differently. So I think that people are doing better than they did 20, 30 years ago in rearing children, right? And both, whether they're male or female. But I think for like a young guy, this might look like, you know, something happening like, George Floyd happens in the news, right? And, it might look, is someone asks like, oh, how are you dealing with this? Like, this is crazy. Like, how are you doing? It might be like, oh, like people do, like this is the same old stuff. So like, what are you going to do about it? So like just dismissing that you have like a real emotional experience with it, right? Whereas someone who's more connected or aware to their feelings, and I'll just use myself as an example. When Ahmaud Arbery, when the news of his murder sort of hit the airwaves, I remember that there were days after when I would just go out to take a walk. Well, I'd go to the door to put my shoes on to go take a walk, that fear just swept over me.
Yeah.
Right. And I could say like, oh, I'm scared to go outside because what if someone decides I'm not supposed to be where I am?
Right.
Right. And so I'm able to identify that for myself because I've done a lot of work, but that's not education I got when I was a kid. So that was my personal work, and obviously going through training to be a therapist helped that a great deal. But that's the difference, because then I can say, to someone, oh, like, I've actually been really scared and really nervous about being outside. And so then they can offer me support or make an adjustment, right? They can say, oh, like, let's take a walk together,
Right.
right? And then that helps me feel safer. That helps me feel more at ease in that moment.
Right.
Yeah.
My brother actually sent me something. He sent me a little recording of him talking about his experience with how his mental health was addressed being like a young Black kid. And he also sent me it, so I'm just going to read it, but I'll insert the audio.
Hey everyone, I'm Jay's older brother Amir. I feel like early in my life, like my early teen years, I had no real grasp of what mental health even was or how it applied to me. I think at this age, I was so ingrained in my friends and school and sports that I was too young to really experience these things or correctly vocalize your thoughts and feelings about what's going on. So it's hard to say that mental health really played any role around this time. I feel like mental health on a national scale began to be talked about more frequently around the same time it was more distinctly introduced into my life. During early high school, a lot went on related to my mental health and just general life, things, as well as seeing my sister deal with the difficulties of anxiety and depression. Even with all this, I never really considered my mental health and how all of these things applied to me. Whenever people asked how I was doing, I would always say fine or good. And it was not like I had some deep unforeseen pain. I just never really considered analyzing my feelings and responses to everything in my life. I definitely still had support from all directions, but I think it was just a combination of trying to keep the masculine trope of being able to handle everything, paired with just personally not being mentally mature enough to go deeper. Thinking back now, I feel like if I had addressed my mental health more closely, I would have been able to help people around me. I just have a better sense of understanding and empathy. Now I feel like mental health is talked about much more everywhere, day to day, school, social media, between friends. I feel like the idea of going to a therapist is less taboo, and the discussions of depression, anxiety, and other issues are given much more serious consideration. I feel like it's still not where things need to be, but generally we're moving in the right direction. And personally, I feel like I'm much more in tune with my mental health. I feel that, honestly, my mom and my sister were the main reasons that me and my entire family were really introduced to mental health at all and just increasing our understanding. But in general, I also feel that times have changed and more people are open for more and more diverse discussions. And even I talk with my friends about mental health now, and I think another positive from this situation is that I can look back on my life and see the times where my anxiety had maybe taken over my decision making, or how my mood affects others, and be able to recognize those situations and make different responses moving forward. And just as a last note, I think another concrete step I can make is actually going to see a therapist. I feel like the weight of the world right now, and as it always has been for Black people, it just might be a good thing to talk to a professional as opposed to not talking at all, or just talking to your problems to the people around you. And I know and I feel like there's a lot of other Black men and just Black people in general who have begun this process of understanding their mental health, but maybe not going to see a professional, and I think that would be a good next step.
So yeah, I feel like from him and other young Black men, I've kind of seen the similar experience of I wasn't in a serious amount of pain, but I still didn't know that I didn't know how to talk about my feelings, or I didn't know that I was allowed to talk about my feelings. So is that something similar that you've seen in your clients?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because socially, how are you doing is such a normal, everyday question.
Yeah.
And so what that means is that we also all respond in the same way. Like, okay, or good. right? Usually, rarely do people say, "I'm great today," or "I'm actually terrible today," right? No one ever says that. And so I think I love what you shared, because I think it is so reflective of a lot of the experiences of Black men, and I think Black people in general have that stereotype of needing to be strong and together, and so they present as fine always, no matter what's going on, and because that's like socially appropriate, right?
Yeah.
To be like, I'm good. And I think that one thing that we all can do to help advance those conversations in our homes and with our friends and sons, and is just to take that a little step further, right? Just like poke on that question a little bit more. Know that that person's probably going to say good or fine, and then say like, okay, but like really, like what's been happening, right? And maybe that helps them start to talk about, oh, well, like my teacher did this, or the professor said this, and I was pissed, or this happened at home, and it was kind of annoying, and then that's mental health too. Like everyone has mental health.
Yeah.
It's not just, oh, do you have a diagnosable condition or not? It's that your emotional life, which we all have, is mental health. And so we all have emotions. And if we can just challenge each other not to be automatic and saying like, okay or fine, that's one way we can normalize conversations about emotions and beat away that stigma. Like, okay, well, you're good. Like, are you really good? Like, what does good mean? Because you look kind of tired. Are you tired? Why are you so tired? What's going on?
Yeah, I think like even that, simply saying instead of good, you're tired, like tired isn't even really like going into your emotions. It's just saying, yeah, I don't feel great right now. I'm tired. So yes, like simple things like that, I think have a big impact.
Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier about how Black women are helping Black men begin to have these conversations about mental health. And when we think about Black women and their mental health, there's this narrative of like that the like strong Black woman narrative that comes from the sort of like intergenerational trauma that we have in our bodies. So I'm kind of familiar with how intergenerational trauma affects, Black women and Black women's bodies. So I was wondering if you could give some input on how it affects Black men.
Yeah, I think there's a very similar process that happens for Black men. And it's interesting because when we talk about intergenerational trauma, we tend to think about that sharing as being, or that knowledge and that trauma is being shared through like expression and voice and stories, etc. But what's really interesting is what we now know is that sometimes intergenerational trauma is passed down through genes. And so, there's a real interesting field of research that's understanding that the trauma of racism, the trauma of slavery, that the trauma of patriarchy negatively impacts all of us. And I think, Black men also have this, that sort of expectation of being strong or being cool, is something that's both passed down genetically and through experience, but is also then communicated and reinforced in conversations, right? It's not only what someone says to you, it's also what someone doesn't say to you, right? It's like, do they ask you how you're doing, or that's one way to see your value as an emotional being. But what if they don't ask you? That message is maybe they don't care, right? Or if you're watching, a movie or film with your family at home, and a Black man is crying, what's the reaction around the people in the room, right? Are they showing empathy? Do they look like they're concerned, or do they look uncomfortable? That's also a message that gets passed down from generations, even if you say nothing. And so it's like sometimes what it looks like in working through that is helping people understand what are those messages that you got from people, whether they were said or unsaid, and then how was that influenced by your history and your lineage as a Black person, right? What stories did you hear growing up? What meaning did you take from that? I mean, when I was coming up, it was a rite of passage to watch Roots, and I like suffered through that several times over because my mom was obsessed. And I was like, can we not watch? I don't want to see like people getting beat and like all these awful things happening. But like, she was like, no, you need to understand this. And, but that also, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because that part of that message is like, we can survive anything, right? We're resilient people. And that's what I love about Black people. And that's what I like to communicate Black people, to create safety in spaces like this is part of your DNA, that you are survivors. You are, we are all people who can be resilient in very particular ways. But that doesn't mean you always have to be strong, right? And strong doesn't look like being okay. Sometimes strong means being able to break down and then regroup when you need to and get back to things. That's also strong. So yeah, unpacking a lot of those messages, and I think is really important for people.
Well, you just said something that my son might not be happy that I bring it up, but I think it's fine. So that was the first time that I heard his excerpt about mental health. But I was just reminded of when he was in 4th grade, he was kind of goofing off and being silly in class. At the same time, when he would come home from school almost daily, he would break down and cry. So we spoke with his school psychologist, who he started having lunch with her once a week. And she just explained that for him, he was holding it together during the day so that when he came home, he felt safe enough to break down and cry or just let loose. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's really powerful. And I think what I've also seen is that there are some people who don't even do that.
Right.
Right. Like even at home, it actually isn't a safe space.
Yeah.
And so they don't allow themselves to actually be vulnerable, to be romantic, which is considered like unmanly in a way, right? To be affectionate in particular ways, to cry, to express joy. Like even one of the things I've actually talked about clients with is that, it's okay for you to smile.
Wow.
Because I'm like, when do you express joy and how do you express joy? Right. And just like we don't recognize that, like, oh, actually there's coded language messages we get about smiling, that it's inherently feminizing.
Yeah.
Right. And so then you think about what you feel. Okay, maybe I'm not supposed to feel joy. Right. So it's a lot of unpacking and like relearning. And I think that's why it's important for me to have conversations like this, because I think that's how you create safety, and that's how you give people the permission to be their fuller selves, no matter the situation, and to work towards that.
Yeah, I think, like, Mom, how you were mentioning how the psychologist said he was holding things together. I do think that holding together, that happens a lot in the home. And I feel like, especially in Black families, in terms of like speaking up as a young person to the like older people in the family, speaking up in any way can be seen as like disrespectful and having an attitude and being disobedient. So like, how do we navigate like being these emotional beings that are being affected, but being scared about speaking up about it because we don't want to come across as being disrespectful to our family? Like, I feel like that's a struggle that a lot of Black kids have, especially right now, because a lot of us have to be at home because of the pandemic. So we're forced to be in environments with our parents where we may feel like we don't have space to process our emotions. So do you have like any input on how to navigate that?
Yeah, I have 2 quick points. One would be try to it is important to communicate those things. I think the important thing is to keep in mind to try to communicate them when you're not highly emotionally activated.
Mm-hmm.
So, right, like when the thing happens, especially if this is your family dynamic and that you feel like you can't necessarily express things because it's seen this way, take a beat, make a note of it, and then bring it back when you feel a bit calmer. That's a very small part of my answer. The bigger part of my answer is that it has nothing to do with the kids.
Right. Right.
It's the parent's responsibility
Absolutely.
to create the environment of safety, right? And I think one of the things I've really appreciated seeing on Twitter is someone I've seen this come up several times, just the idea to normalize apologizing to your children, which I know that like in Black families, that is not a thing. That's not a thing, right? Because I know if there's some parents listening to this, I know like, oh my God, this man has lost his mind, right? But like, how do you, like, right? That's because at home you're really teaching, your family how to negotiate the world. You're teaching your kids how to do that, right? And so if you can, as a parent, create a little bit more space to also not be reactive, right? And your kid says, actually, that really hurt my feelings. To take a beat and to deal with, and I know as a parent, that means a lot of different things for you, right? So a lot comes up for you emotionally. Just take a moment to pause and let the first thing that comes out of your mouth be, you know what? I'm sorry, that was not my intention. And prioritize that, then say whatever else you have to say, because that is the reinforcement that we need, as Black people within families and otherwise. That's the acknowledgement. That's the validation to say, what you said was valid. And I appreciate you sharing that with me. And it's hard work, right? But I think that's what really has to be done.
So my next question is on a different path. It's more about you and your experience as someone working in the mental health field. So first, I just want to ask, like, what inspired you to make your own practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had been working in mental health for several years. And I think one of the things I found really troubling about the field was that we weren't talking about mental health from a holistic or integrative perspective, right? And some of that speaks to like cultural issues, but I think in large part it was like largely the mental health field is very medical, and so there's like this disconnect from like your brain and the rest of your body, right? And I was like, it doesn't make sense like intuitively that like we experience stress both like in our thoughts but also in our bodies. I know when I'm like going through it, like I might have back pain or my neck gets stiff, right? Or like all these I have like digestional trouble, and I'm like, oh, like something's going on with me. And so, but people like the field tends to sort of focus on thoughts and thoughts and thoughts in mental health. And I was like, well, this doesn't make sense. We have to take care of a whole person and not just look at them as a symptom, a cluster of symptoms, right? So being able to talk about all these different things, like how your body's experiencing the world and how the world experiences you and how that impacts how you feel and see things. And so for me and my business partner, like it was important for us to create a space where we could treat people holistically And we always say that, like, we, even as therapists, we show up as people first and providers second.
Yeah.
And that a lot of times gets lost in healthcare, because you turn into a diagnosis. They say, oh, you have high blood pressure? Take this pill. This is what you're going to do. Instead of saying, like, hey, Jess, it seems like I'm noticing that you have elevated blood pressure. Let's talk about what may be behind that. You know, it could be a diet thing, but it also could be a stress thing. What's going on in your life? Maybe you'd benefit from this, because it often is both, right? And so that's why it was really important for us to start this practice and be able to speak to a lot of people and offer resources for people who don't have access to therapy or don't yet see it as a viable option. So, like, with whether it's with our podcast or the resources that are on our page, to say, if you want to work on some things, here are some things for you to start with, and that you know is coming from a good place, from like a reasonable, responsible, professional place, that you could start to do some work and feel good about that.
Yeah. So when Black men come to your practice, do you find that they feel safe because you're a Black therapist? And do they seek you out because you're a Black therapist?
Yes and yes. For that reason. And one of the things, I love the internet because, you know, you get to be visible. And that's why it's really important for me to be a visible Black male therapist.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, okay, you get to see me, you get to see my fro, you get to see all that I'm coming with.
Right.
And I'm going to be like, okay, so what's the feeling? Let's talk about it. Let's get in there. And that, I think it's so important. And it's interesting because I'm in New York City, and even in New York City, I'm very rare.
Yeah.
It's very rare to be a Black male therapist. And all the time I do initial phone consults with people before we meet, just to like see if there's a fit, see if they have any questions before we get started, etc. And 9 times out of 10, someone verbally expresses, man, I'm so glad I found you.
Wow.
For that reason.
Wow.
To say, like, oh, I know because, oh, I tried therapy before and it was like this old white woman. And
yeah.
I would say I felt like I had to like shield how I was talking with her. I'm like, oh no, we're not going to code switch here. You talk how you talk. Let's go.
Right.
Right. And I think that's really important to create that safety, you know, to just say, like, just show up as you are. And I think that my visible self communicates that, and I reinforce that in the work that I do.
Wow. So as a professional in the field, what is your experience, meaning between yourself and other mental health professionals? What is that like, navigating being, I'm guessing, one of the few Black therapists probably in the whole country, male therapists?
There are not a lot of us.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like, to be honest, especially in a real metropolitan area, it's been a bonus for me, because I stick out. And in this field, that's a good thing.
Right.
Because there aren't a lot of male therapists. Like, if your people are hiring for a team, they already have mostly female counselors. And so they're like, oh, it would be really good to have a male therapist on board, right? Mm-hmm. But I think other than that, I've been very fortunate. I will say that. I think the thing that's difficult is sort of like living at that intersection of being a Black man and having to navigate conversations around culture and race. Sometimes does become hairy, because most of the times I'm in a room with a lot of white women, right? And so I have to be conscious of how I am showing up as a Black person, but also as a man.
Right.
Because if I say, actually, what you said was wrong for this reason, then I'm like the man who's like stepping up and saying, like, oh, what you're saying is wrong.
Right.
Right. But at the same time, I know that I'm not trying to speak from this like I'm mansplaining kind of thing, but I'm saying, like, no, I have this lived experience that can inform what you're saying. And so for me, that's always been a delicate dance of like how forward or how assertive can I be in spaces for that reason.
This is just a question out of curiosity, because I want to work in the field. So like what degree did you get?
Yeah, great question.
Yeah.
So I went to undergrad and got my bachelor's in psychology, which is not required to be a therapist, by the way. Obviously, very, very helpful because I had like a 4-year head start on psychology when I got to grad school. And so I was like, yeah, I remember that. All right, take this a little bit deeper. So I got 2 master's degrees in psychological counseling. So my program was a 2-year program, which I think is relatively the same across the board. And my program was a license eligible program. So what that means is that it is a track that sort of gives you the ability to be licensed after graduation with the state, because every state requires a license. And so, I went to a program that met all the educational requirements for licensure. And then after getting my degrees, my master's degrees, I had to do a couple of years of supervised practice and pass an exam to be able to be licensed.
Okay. I think I often hear the white path to becoming a therapist, and there's a lot of I don't know, I just feel like there's probably a lot of young Black people who are looking to be a therapist, but like there's not many models of that. So yeah, I'm just always interested when I do get to talk to a Black therapist to see like what path they chose. Just because I want to see what might work for me. Because I know we need more of us in the field.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we are almost at time, and I want to make sure that people are able to, reach you and see all of the work that you're doing. So what are some ways that we and our listeners can stay up to date with the work that you're doing and the stuff that's going on with Viva Wellness?
Yeah, I think the best way to keep up with me and what I'm doing is to keep up with Viva. So you can find us on Instagram and Twitter at Viva Wellness NYC. We have a podcast. It's on most major podcast platforms called the Viva Wellness Podcast, where you hear me and my business partner, who's also my good friend, talk about all sorts of mental health and related things. We think we're pretty funny because we're very much the same, but also a little different, which is also why we work. She's a white woman. I'm a Black man. We are the best of friends, and we work really well together. And we have conversations like this, in our personal lives, but also on the podcast. So that's a good way to keep up with us. And I also have social media, but to be honest, I don't, update it that often. So Viva's the best way you'll know what's going on with me. So please follow us, send us questions, send us ideas. We're always happy to engage with people. And, if there are things that you want to hear about from me or us, like let us know because we're happy to have conversations that people want to hear and provide those resources.
Okay. And then lastly, this question was supposed to be earlier, but I think it's definitely important. What's one thing or just something that you think Black men and boys need to hear right now?
It's a good question. I think that one thing I want Black men and boys to know is that you have value and worth, not just because how you show up or what expectations you feel for people, but just as you are, without filter or disclaim, you have worth and value. And I just want you to sit with that idea and visit with that whenever you don't feel strong. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. You're going to make my mom cry. Thank you so much for being here. I am really glad that we had this conversation, and I'm excited to listen back to it and share this. I think this was a much needed conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate the opportunity. I love talking about these things. I do it most of the day, all day. So I could do it more. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Students of Mind. We really enjoyed our conversation with Jor-El, and we hope that you did too. For resources and social media mentioned in the episode, check the description of this episode. I also wanted to say thank you for 250 downloads, which is really exciting. And I've really enjoyed doing this podcast, and I'm glad that others are seeming to enjoy it as well. If you get a chance, please give the show a review so we can get the information being shared in each episode into more ears to help destigmatize mental health. Thank you again for listening, and I will see you next time.